welcome to our podcast. For those of you that have met us before, you will know that we are Manchester Communication Research School. My name is Susie Fraser. I am Director of Research School.
And I'm Rebecca Hawthorne-Thwaite, the Assistant Director of the Research School.
And our guest today really needs no introduction, but we are delighted to welcome Dylan Wiliam to our podcast. For anyone who doesn't know, Dylan is a teacher, a researcher and a writer, currently based in the United States, making us very jealous about that. He was born and educated in the UK. In fact, went to Altrincham Grammar School for Boys, which is just down the road from us in Greater Manchester. So we've already got a connection. He's probably most renowned for his book, Inside the Black Box, which really transformed the conversation about assessment in schools. Many of you may be aware that just the last week, the EEF launched their promising programmes, and Embedding Formative Assessment, which is a piece of Dylan's work, is now available to schools who can sign up at a subsidised rate, and it's really showing great promise. When we told one of our colleagues that we were speaking with Dylan today, he said, Dylan Wiliam is where it really all began. Welcome to the podcast, Dylan. Thank you for joining us. Okay, so we have 5 questions that we always ask. How are you today?
Good.
You good? How's the weather in the States?
We're awaiting Hurricane Helene, which is going to pass probably about 200 miles west of us, so we should be okay, but we're going to batten down the hatches later on today.
Yes, we've got a bit of rain, but
yeah,
nothing like that.
Manchester drizzle is about all we have.
Downside of living in Florida.
We're really interested, obviously, you've had such a history of research in education, but we'd be keen to know more about your introduction to or your journey to evidence-informed practice.
So I guess my starting point was when I enrolled for a master's degree in mathematics education in the 1980s. I never trained as a teacher. I started teaching at a time when the shortage of teachers of maths and science was so acute that just basically if you had a maths degree or a science degree, you could get a job without a qualification. And so I pretty much picked up the job, you know, in the classroom. But then I thought that I should kind of atone my lack of formal educational qualifications by doing a master's degree. And although it was quite a lot of mathematics as well as mathematics education, I think that was when I first became aware of research. One of the big courses we did was about problem solving, and I was quite interested in the research there. But I think really it didn't inform my practice very much. So a lot of the research I was reading was laboratory research. It was quite kind of interesting, but it didn't inform practice. And it wasn't really until I'd actually been working on a lot of research projects around national curriculum assessment. It wasn't until that was put to one side and Paul Black and I started working on formative assessment that we really began thinking about how might research inform day-to-day classroom practice. Before that, we were looking at summative assessment, how to make sure it was reasonably valid. Then when we worked onto formative assessment, we realized that there was a huge area here that was underexplored. This idea that every time a teacher makes a judgment about what to do next on the basis of evidence from students, that's a kind of assessment. And so that's when we started. So it really took off in the late 1990s when we saw assessment as a way of helping teachers make their classrooms more responsive to their pupils' needs.
I think a lot of people, when we would ask them that question now, would probably say that piece of research was their first introduction to evidence-informed practice. So it's really nice to kind of see that full circle. My question is about light bulb moments. And could you tell us about any light bulb moments that you've experienced with evidence-informed practice? I think you've alluded a little bit to that already, but if you could just expand on that for us.
The one that comes closest to qualifying for a light bulb moment is my reading of the work of John Sweller on cognitive load theory. So I first came across cognitive load theory in the late 1980s, and it didn't feel right to me. And more importantly, I didn't want it to be right, because I'd been teaching maths and science using a problem-solving approach. And I really didn't want to believe that I'd been teaching in a way that was actually unhelpful for a lot of my students. So I really kind of resisted that research for a long time. But I saw more and more of this research being published, and I decided to really dive deeply into it. And that's when, in 2017, I sent out a tweet saying that I had come to the conclusion that cognitive load theory was the single most important thing for teachers to know. Not because it's the only important thing, but it's the one that's most counterintuitive and the one that can make the biggest difference to how inclusive our classrooms are. And I think that, so it wasn't quite it was a light bulb, but it was a light bulb on a dimmer. So basically, it didn't just flash on, but it kind of got brighter and brighter and brighter. And that's the closest I've had to a kind of light bulb moment.
I really relate to that. And I think a lot of teachers do, in terms of evidence-informed practice can sometimes feel counterintuitive. And so one of the challenges, because one of my roles within school is around staff professional development, and one of the obstacles around that is kind of getting that buy-in from staff when they come with their preconceived, but a lot of the time very rich professional judgment and experience, and squaring that against what it says in the research and trying to bring that to life in an evidence-informed way is challenging, but obviously it really moves the conversation forward, doesn't it? So I really relate to that. I kind of linked to that is the next question about best bets in evidence, because there are limitations obviously to research evidence to some extent in practice, and it's about us identifying the best bets of evidence-informed practice. So if you had to pick one, what would you say is the best bet when it comes to evidence-informed practice?
Well, I think if you've got to use research, you have to find a way through the kind of extremes of research will tell teachers what to do, because it won't. And the other extreme, which is research is irrelevant. All that matters is teachers' experience. So if you look at the research evidence, I think there are 5 questions we should ask of any research study. The first is, does it solve a problem we have? So if you looked at research, for example, on how to select the best teachers, that's relevant if you have a choice amongst teachers. But if it's hard enough to find even one person to apply for the job you've got, working out who the best one is irrelevant. It doesn't help, it doesn't matter. So the first question is, does it solve the problem we have? The second question is, if we do this well, how much extra achievement will we get? How much faster will our students learn? The third question is, how much will it cost? Not in money, but in terms of teacher time. I've come to the conclusion that opportunity cost is the single most important concept in educational reform, because every hour that teachers spend doing one thing is an hour they don't have to spend on something else. Question 4 is, can we implement it here? So things like class size reduction can be effective. I think it's a waste of money, but it can be effective if you have a supply of extra good teachers. If you don't have extra good teachers, then class size reduction will actually make things worse, because you'll end up employing teachers who are worse than the teachers you've already got. So can we implement it here? And the 5th question is, do we know what to do? And that's where the rubber really hits the road. So if you were told that the effect size of collaborative learning is 0.4 standard deviations, or even an extra 2 months of learning, that doesn't help you, because you don't know what to do in the classroom. So the 2 best bets are curriculum development and formative assessment. Now, curriculum development, a good curriculum can be significantly more effective. A good textbook can improve student learning by about 25%. But we don't know in advance what makes a good curriculum. We can determine that retrospectively. So the 5th question, do we know what to do, brings us to classroom formative assessment. The fact is, we know how to help teachers get better at this. We've got large-scale randomized controlled trials funded by the Education Endowment Foundation that shows that this is highly cost-effective. We know exactly how to support teachers doing this. So that's why helping teachers improve their classroom formative assessment is my best bet. Right now, there is nothing that we know of that's going to have a bigger impact on student achievement for a smaller commitment of teacher time.
Thank you. And I think that a lot you talked about there was around the challenges of implementation. And, you know, when school leaders are really grappling with that need to improve results and improve outcomes, there can be an urge or a desire to kind of pick the thing that looks the one that's going to have the most impact, or the school down the road is doing that, or you know, there's lots of talk of it on Twitter, and the risk is that there might be something in that, but if it's not right for your setting and it's not feasible, or you haven't got the means to do it really well, then you do more damage than good effectively. And I guess what we know about formative assessment is it's one of those strategies that As you said, teachers can continue to get better at that, and we know that it's going to make a difference. So thank you for that.
One more thing there as well that's really important, and that is we also know that teachers aren't doing it. Because if teachers are doing it already, then it wouldn't be helpful because we've already got the benefit. But the fact is, around the country, teachers are routinely asking a class of students a question, getting a response from 2 or 3 students, and making a decision about the learning needs of the entire group of pupils based on the responses of the most confident, articulate pupils in the classroom. And a moment's reflection should convince you that can't be right. So the fundamental idea of classroom formative assessment is that if teachers have better evidence about what's going on in pupils' heads, they'll make better decisions about what to do next that results in better learning. So it comes down to better evidence, better decisions, better learning.
And we did quite a lot of work here a few years ago on when the guidance report came out for effective assessment and really understanding the principles, because there's also a risk, isn't there, that teachers can pick up a strategy and do a strategy for strategy's sake. But we know that feedback is about understanding, identifying misconceptions, moving learning forward. And if teachers are able to understand those principles, then they're more likely to use the strategy to greater effect. And there's those challenges you talked about curriculum before. There's that tension of we've got to get through content, and that, again, a misconception that getting through content is a teacher speaking the content rather than how well the students have learned and understand it. And that's a challenge for school leaders, isn't it?
There's also the issue, and I think we have to be honest about this, doing formative assessment well takes time. There's no point in doing formative assessment if you haven't got any slack, because you're wasting time collecting evidence you can't use.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that senior leadership needs to understand is if there's no slack, there's no way of making your teaching responsive to student needs. You're going to teach it, and then you're going to move on because there isn't time to do anything else. So I think what senior leaders need to understand is we have to create slack. So for example, in a half term, we might plan to teach this content, but we make sure that we only teach the first 80%, for example, in the first 5 weeks, give some sort of assessment at the end of week 5, and use that assessment to decide what to do in the final week of the half term. You can do the same thing in a lesson. You've got an hour's lesson, but you plan the content to be possible to deliver in 50 minutes. Then you do a quick assessment, and then you've got 5 minutes either for extension, if your assessment reveals all the pupils have got it, or review and revision if you find out that they didn't get it. But I think we have to be honest about this. You won't cover as much content if you do formative assessment. The good news is your pupils will get better GCSE grades.
Maybe that's a message we can feed into the curriculum review that's open at the moment to respond to. I think that's
good luck with that.
A good point. We won't get into politics.
No, it's not politics. It's that people don't like taking things away. That's why John Hattie and I wrote a book called Making Room for Impact. People think that the way to make education more efficient is to take away bad things, but there aren't any bad things. There's no bad content in our curriculum. The only way to make our curriculum more manageable is to stop teaching good things to give time to spend more time on the even better things. And that's what people find very difficult to embrace.
And that leads nicely into our next question, which is about implementation. And we're interested in what element of research you have seen others that you work with, other leaders, other teachers find really tricky to implement.
It comes down to a very simple dichotomy. We tend to think of teachers needing professional development in the form of knowledge that they don't currently have. So we see professional development as knowledge acquisition, telling teachers stuff that they don't know. That may be helpful for novice teachers, but for the most experienced teachers, getting better is hardly ever needing to find new knowledge. It's using the knowledge you've already got. Every teacher I know knows the research on wait time. They know they don't wait long enough. But reminding them of the research of wait time has about as much impact on their teaching as reminding smokers of the harmful effects of smoking. It's not a knowledge problem, it's a habit change problem. And I think where we've gone wrong in professional development for teachers is to assume that what teachers lack is knowledge. What they lack is support in changing classroom habits that get them through the day. And so there's this two-sided double-edged sword, if you like, that the habits you develop as an experienced teacher make your teaching manageable. You can't get through the day without those routines, but some of them are actually less effective for people's learning. So it's helping teachers change their classroom habits. And that's why, so basically any change that involves adding knowledge is relatively easy. Any change that involves changing what teachers do in classrooms is much harder. That's the one thing I've learned from 30 years of professional development with teachers. It's much easier to change what teachers do when pupils are not present than it is to change what teachers do when pupils are present. Changing what teachers do in the classroom is really hard. That's why implementation is so difficult.
I think we would both share that sentiment. We have spent a lot of time here at Manchester Communication Academy implementing deliberate practice as part of our professional development curriculum, so that every time we have any sort of training session, there is that opportunity to embed practice, to rehearse it, to receive feedback on it, to refine it, then to take it into the classroom and receive some coaching feedback on that as well. And we're still really learning, aren't we, of the kind of how we make that as impactful as possible. But we've both spent a lot of time in our careers in professional development, and building that into professional development has been the biggest challenge as leaders of PD in schools, but equally the most transformative in terms of changing what happens in the classroom as a result of PD, and not being seen as a kind of compliance activity that people come along and they might have a nice time, but it's actually changing the habits and the behaviours in the classroom. And we absolutely share that sentiment.
And that's what drives the structure of the embedding formative assessment program. The idea is that teachers come to a meeting together, they agree what they're going to try out, they go away and come back a month later and share with their peers what they've done and get feedback on it. So the idea is that you're constantly trying to develop your skills in practice. So it's actually taking the research and figuring out, what does this mean in my classroom for my teaching, for my pupils?
And we found that in terms of staff motivation and buy-in when it comes to professional development is much more powerful, as well as changing the practice. It enables them to be the professional, the thinking professional that's engaging with the research, rather than kind of something being done to them, or kind of
But I think there's another element here as well. When assessment for learning was made part of the Key Stage 3 strategy, and under the previous Labour administration, the real problem was this idea of reporting national curriculum levels and sub-levels didn't seem to teachers like it was part of their agenda. It was basically the SLT wanted these sub-levels reported. And so it wasn't addressing teachers' daily issues. I think the reason that embedding formative assessment is so well focused is it starts from the fundamental question: did your pupils learn what you taught them? Every teacher I've ever met gets that part of their day job. Keeping records, submitting numbers to senior leadership. Most teachers think of that as a distraction, but figuring out, what did my pupils learn as a result of my teaching, and what can I do to make sure that learning is sticky, that every teacher gets. So you can have research that might be powerful, but if it's not part of teachers' work pattern, it's going to be very hard to implement. And that's why I also think this is not just this year's new fad, because as long as teachers are focusing on what did I just do and what did my pupils learn, as long as teachers are looking at those two things, they'll always be able to advance their practice.
Great. And that leads us to our final question, which I'm fascinated to know, with your vast experience and understanding. Is there an area of practice that you think there should be more research in that there isn't currently?
I think there are lots of areas where the research isn't as good as we'd like. So I'm now becoming convinced that research that identifies categories, like the approach of people like John Hattie in Australia and New Zealand and the UK, the work of Robert Morzano in the United States, which produces effect sizes for categories of things like collaborative learning or cooperative learning or differentiated learning. I think that whole fundamental idea is misguided, because the boxes themselves that you're putting these studies into are so diverse that it contains no guidance at all. So I think we need to stop researching topic areas and start researching programs, packages. And that's why I think the work that the Education Endowment Foundation has been doing is so powerful, because it's not taking an idea like collaborative learning, it's taking a program that specifically helps. And that's important for two reasons. First of all, it actually helps teachers know, well, what was done to get this effect size?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, you know that the same thing was done in all these different settings.
Mm.
And that's why the evaluation by the National Institute for Economic and Social Research of the Embedding Formative Assessment Program, I think is so powerful, is because they randomly allocated 140 high schools to either get the program or some cash. And we know that all the schools got the same thing because they got the same set of DVDs.
Mm.
And so they're basically left alone with some support to get on with it. And because we got a significant effect size, we know that's scalable because we know exactly what we did. We gave them the DVDs, and that's very easy to reproduce. As soon as you get into programs that require training and support, you don't know it's being implemented in the same way in different schools. So you don't know what you did to get the effects that you find.
It's so interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much. And particularly on this kind of program development, we've been talking recently about early stage program development and, you know, kind of getting started in that world of innovation and using what we know about research and trying to develop a program that, again, could potentially become a promising program many, many years down the line. So it's very exciting to hear you talk, and I'm sure we'll continue our conversations. Before we let you go, can you tell us what's next for you? Is there anything on the horizon that we could keep our eyes out for?
Well, I'm just trying to finish off a book about assessment and grading, but that's primarily for American teachers. I think my real concern, my next project will probably be around implementation, understanding what needs to be in place for programs like embedding formative assessment to be successfully implemented. We've now got enough evidence about what we need to be doing. What we need is understanding why people do and do not implement that. So we've done the first stage. The first stage was the book that I wrote with John Hattie and Aaron Hamilton, which is taking stuff off teachers' plates. So give teachers some time to think, just some space to get their lives back after the extraordinary demands that were made of teachers during COVID. So we've got the kind of, we now know how to clear the decks. The next stage is, how do we help teachers implement effective programs more faithfully so that they really have the maximum impact on pupil achievement and other outcomes?
We will await that with excitement. Yeah. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time and the wisdom that you shared with us this afternoon, and for inspiring us as always. Thank you. We wish you well.
Thank you. You're very welcome.